And I should say before I go too much further that my appearance here is also made possible by the College of Arts and Sciences at New Mexico State University, which is where I teach in Las Cruces, New Mexico. It's not that far from the lightning field if you ever get a chance to visit. It's a beautiful part of the country. Trio 8, and here you see two visual artists performing it with Pat Patterson, who's another of the transmitters, in front of that video. This is at MoMA in 2009. These performances, which were alongside Forti's Huddle, Simone Forti's Huddle, prompted me to go to UCLA, where Forti was teaching at the time, and also my dissertation advisor in art history. And Yvonne was at UCI, which is where we studied together. And I'll say that, and I'm probably going to slip between Yvonne and Simone and Forti and Rainer because I have an intimacy with Simone, although I respect no less their contributions as artists. So these works, Huddle is one of a series of what's called the dance constructions, which were collected by MoMA in 2015. And I got to be a close participant and witness in that process, first as her student at UCLA, and then observing that process over the course of my dissertation. Getting to learn these works, I was in New York making this transition from being a professional dancer to being an art historian, and learning these works from the inside, learning them with my body, has helped me understand their relations in the past, as well as the differences between their continuation plans in the present. So here are the two works in the past. Forti's dance constructions, including Huddle, were incredibly influential for Yvonne, as well as the Judson dance theater as a whole. Simone herself did not participate. She was involved with her second husband's work, Robert Whitman, at that time. But she did dance, and she didn't present her own choreography, but she did dance in a number of the Judson Dance Theater pieces, as well as provide sound. This practice of transmitting, which Sarah just gave us a lovely demonstration of, is one of the key ways that the works continue on today in the present, that Simone's works continue on today in the present. And it actually isn't that uncommon of a dance strategy. So the idea of the répétiteur is someone that's, like a dance master or ballet master, is pretty common in ballet and opera. But because these works were not developed with any kind of codified technique, taking that on has been an interesting strategy on both of their parts. So this idea of a transmitter is how most of these works are carried forward in the future, but not all of them. And I want to talk about the exceptions as well as the ones that are carried forward with the transmitter. And this idea of a political or open source, even democratic dance is especially relevant to Huddle, which we'll talk about towards the end of my presentation. What does it mean for a dance to truly be democratic? And what happens when a dance circulates on its own, stewarded by the people who make it, so without a specific designated transmitter? Is that possible? And Huddle tells us certainly yes. So I saw these MoMA performances, as I mentioned, as I was making this transition from being a dancer and choreographer to an art historian. My friends and I were being offered these kinds of jobs in institutions, and I thought, okay, that's interesting, but I think there really is something significant here in terms of art history and conservation. What is going to happen to these dances, and what does it mean to bring these kinds of competencies and knowledges into the institution? So as I mentioned, I worked with Forti as part of her UCLA class, and then I was invited to be one of these students who were recorded in this evening of dance constructions, where she was teaching them herself. So these are my classmates from our improvisation class in 2011. This is my right ear, and back here is Forti teaching us how to do all of the dance constructions. And this was the first like full set of them recorded at once, and these video recordings are at the heart of the acquisition by MoMA. So they are one of the most important pieces in that in that package that they assembled. I got to interview Forti throughout the whole process, as well as her gallerist and the curators and conservators at MoMA. So giving me like a really sort of inside and outside perspective of that. And today I remain close with the artist and have seen some of the works change over time now that I've been following it for over a decade. So if you're not familiar with the dance constructions, they were 5 works that originally debuted in 1961. They were performed at Yoko Ono's loft on Chambers Street in New York City. This is a map that Forti drew. Locating each of the works in space. They're sculptural works that don't move like through space. They stay in one place and have like a sustained action for the whole time. Most of them use equipment made of plywood and rope, with the exception of Huddle, which has no equipment. You can just make it in the moment. It was part of a series. Her Evening 5 Dance Constructions and Some Other Things was part of a series that was multidisciplinary, consisting of music, sculpture, poetry, and theater. It featured artists such as her husband, Robert Morris, that was her first husband, her husband at the time, and the composer Lamont Young, with whom she was very close, and he organized that series. Remarkably, it did not include Ono herself, which I think is quite rude. The term dance constructions, and I will say that Forti was the only female identified artist in that series. The term dance constructions itself signals that Forti was inventing something new, something hybrid, something different from just straight up dance. It signifies a sort of conceptual and architectural features in addition to dance and sculptural features. These works really extend into multiple areas in terms of their influence and just in terms of their composition. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of one performance of Huddle. This took place in 2009. And you can also see the artist in the background once the camera pulls away. I don't know. I mean, I know that Sarah Swinton is wearing the red shirt and Sarah's a dancer. And based on the purple tank top outfit that looks like a dance outfit, she tends to mix the groups up between dance people and non-dance people. I'll stop it there. You can see there's no like specialized technique to this work. The movements are being done in a fairly intuitive way. Whoever climbs next is happening just based on the like mutual rearrangement and feeling like intuitive feelings of the group. It consists of 7 to 10 performers clustered together in that huddle and climbing over each other. Inside of Huddle, you have to share that responsibility and pay attention to your close colleagues and figure out between you without speaking like who's going next. It happens fairly automatically. 2 other works that I'll describe here. Slamboard consists of ropes tied to the top of this slanted plywood, and the climbers use knots in the ropes to get up and down and move across the surface. Each of these works like emphasizes a singular action over an extended period of time. They all last about 10 minutes. And Platforms is one of my favorites, where a pair of performers comes out and lays under those wooden boxes They whistle back and forth to each other. It's a long, low whistle, like on an exhale. It's just like the sound of an out breath, and they call back and forth to each other over the course of about 10 minutes. Those boxes act like resonating chambers, so that the whistle gets a little louder. But you can see none of these have costumes, none of these have lights, none of them are performed on stage, and here we get this like nice illustration of that where the people watching are actually sitting on the stage and the performances are taking place on the gymnasium floor. They emphasize real-time interaction, physical forces such as gravity, mass, and weight. And they also have a sense of porousness around them, as if you could just join in at any time, that the audience and the participants are, or the audience and the performers are not very separated. Obviously, this was really different from the other dance that was happening at the time. Here we have Balanchine, Graham, and Cunningham. As Sarah rightly acknowledged, they were all and Joanna, they were all studying with these people at the time. Yvonne and Simone both took classes with Cunningham and Graham. Obviously, this is like stylized technique, difficult movements. It's all performed on a stage. They all have costumes of some kind, even if they're simplified, they're a certain kind of costume. And works like Huddle and Trio A were just radically different from this. This low-key, task-based movement was enormously influential for the Judson Dance Theater, as I mentioned, especially Yvonne. They were close friends. Robert Morris, Forti's husband, claimed, quote, that Forti set the agenda for the experimental dance that followed her in the 1960s. He credited her with inventing, quote, contact, improvisation, games with rules, voice as text, and as sound in dance, task-generating movement. In short, those strategies aimed at crushing the narcissistic dancer and her bag of tricks based on professional training. All of these things Forti developed single-handedly. That was Morris attributing to her these inventions. But Forti was also enormously influential for movements like minimalism and sculpture. I also mentioned Fluxus already and conceptual art. Morris was her husband at the time, and he built these, the equipment and the props for her. He performed in her works, and he even reused some of the props as his own sculpture. So Forti and her experiments helped to introduce the use of basic reusable materials like the plywood rope, the bodily scale that we see in minimalist sculpture, as well as temporality and even ephemerality in sculpture. And Morris went on to use these to revolutionize sculpture in minimalism and what are called post-minimal practices such as installation, process art, performance art, conceptual art. So I've been rewriting this narrative of having Forti and the body and dance at this initiating moment of this explosion of practices. And I think these comparisons also help us see how the dance constructions weren't entirely dance. So we've narrated them often through a dance lens, but they are equally important as visual arts, music, poetry, a much more like interdisciplinary and amorphous kind of field. For example, platforms, there's no movement at all, it's just listening. And they had, as I mentioned, conceptual features, architectural features, and even musical features. So after 1961, Forti made theatrical performances with her second husband, Robert Whitman. She made her own multimedia works that were more like visual art than anything else. She made works that with slides and video. She also made a lot of musical works like singing. She continued with dance improvisation, especially later in the 1960s and early in the 1970s, which is how maybe a lot of people know her work. And she collaborated with stable groups of people, mostly in the late 80s and early 90s, and then she traveled the world as a teacher, which is how a lot of people know her around the world. The question of collecting Huddle was raised in 2009, around the time of these performances. So starting around 2000, she had been increasingly asked to restage these performances. It started with Baryshnikov's Pass Forward project, and at which a number of museum curators were able to see the works of the Judson Dance Theater. That was around the year 2000. So Forti, in the year when this was raised in 2009, did not have a dance company. She never had a dance company. And she did have a concern for the legacy of her work after her lifetime. The proposition recognized the relations of this work to historical movements in visual art. So what I was just talking about, fluxus, conceptualism, performance art, the happenings. She and her works were really important for those movements, and they, the museum being interested recognized this relationship. And they also resembled practices that the museum had been collecting for a long time. So as they've been collecting performance art and conceptual art and so on, they had a strong relationship with dance constructions. And then this moment in the early 2000s, as many of you know, was a moment when performance was becoming increasingly popular within museum spaces. So, faced with the internet and digital culture, live performance was starting to offer something a little bit new, a way for different institutions to distinguish themselves. When they were finally collected in 2016, so the deal was finalized in late 2015 and then announced to the public in 2016, it took about 6 years to negotiate. These were the first works of historical dance that the Museum of Modern Art in New York had collected, and they're among the first works of historical dance collected anywhere by a major museum. There are a number of made-for-museum dances that have been collected, but these are among the first to have been translated for that context. So it took 6 years. It went from just Huddle to collecting 9 works in the end. So the entire suite of the dance constructions plus a few other works. There were 5 to begin with, and then they added 4 other works. And it wasn't a straightforward, easy process. There were moments when it seemed like the deal was going to fall apart altogether. Forti was, really skeptical that it was going to happen at all. But eventually it did. They collected a number of physical things. So it took a long time to figure out what to do, and one of the things they did just instinctively is collect some archival documentary objects that were in mediums that the museum is used to collecting. So we see here on the left a drawing that is the map that I showed you at the beginning. Forti recollected the works in her 1974 Handbook in Motion, and this map was the one that she drew. I'm showing you here this tattered piece of paper because it was taped up on her desk for a long time. And eventually made its way into Moma's collection. They tried to remove that tape residue, and they can to a certain extent, but not totally. These are a set of prints that make sort of a historical argument for the works being in the museum. They're also beautiful images, but they were collected as prints. Forti didn't have the negatives to these works, and they were collected as prints, which sort of highlights their existence as a one-of-a-kind object. There were not any photographs, film, or video from the May 1961 performances, like the early Trio A performances, that anyone knows about. If they materialize sometime in the future, it will be to everyone's surprise. So all the documentation that MoMA collected was of later instances. This work is a lot like the Trio A film. It's one of the earliest known recordings of Huddle, taken in 1974. Forti is seen there on the top, climbing over it, so it's valuable also as a recording that has the artist in it. It's not a great document of the work. It's dark. The video quality is quite poor. It also has some idiosyncrasies, like a telephone rings in the middle of one of the performances. They're talking. Forti's talking to the camera person. But more than anything, MoMA didn't want just objects. They wanted the live works. They wanted to be able to produce these live works. And in some ways it seemed really obvious. Oh, they stay in one place. They seem really simple. This should be able to happen without too much trouble. But on the other hand, they would have to continue to ensure their quality over time. And the museum felt really skittish about teaching dance to new performers. That was sort of outside the realm of its competencies. Like in the collections management protocol or policy at MoMA, it says that you must be able to house and care for the object using standard museum practices, and dance is not, as far as so far, a standard museum practice. So Forti had to give them the tools to ensure that they could continue to take care of these. She worked in museums for several years. As I mentioned, starting around 2000, the works have been increasingly performed, so she had some evidence that it could be done. And it wasn't just at MoMA, they were in biennials in Berlin, Brazil, Korea, and ultimately she came up with 4 models. So instead of just one model for all the works, she came up with 4 different models that apply to different works differently. And that's what I'll talk about now, is the 4 different models. The first one I call a conceptual model. That doesn't consist of any body-to-body transmission. It applies to 2 works that were originally the Some Other Things in the 5 dance instructions and Some Other Things performances. So Censor, the work that you see on the left, is a singing contest. One performer sings a folk song at the top of their lungs, and the other person is shaking this pan of nails. It's a metal pan that has like screws inside of it. And it like makes a terrible racket. Like on this bridge in Salzburg, which I was the assistant for the show here, the curatorial assistant for that show. It's loud, but inside a gallery where it's very echoey, it's like almost intolerable as a racket. And here, Forti is rehearsing this other work from instructions, which was performed initially by Robert Morris. 2 performers are given conflicting instructions, and it results in this struggle that lasts. That's really energetic and sustained. And these works punctuated the slower, quieter, more static dance constructions that appeared in the rest of that show. So today they don't require any teaching. Whoever's transmitting them, or whoever's transmitting isn't quite the right word, but whoever's passing them along gives the performers just instructions and they try it out. So you see that here with Forti herself on the side giving the instructions, and the 2 performers are trying it out. Nobody remembers who did it in the first place. There's no recording, there's no real way to recover an original, so it's just created anew every time. And with this model, the pot isn't precious, the screws aren't precious, the song isn't precious, the performers aren't precious. It just gets recreated each time. In that Salzburg experience, we were going to do it on 2 bridges. It was going to be performed on 2 bridges. So I was in part responsible for locating another pot. So there was the one that she had, but then we just went out to a store and bought another pot. Just a regular department store. Likewise with From Instructions, the title is very explicit about the performance being generated from instructions, not through any kind of teaching. So, as I mentioned, Bob Morris was one of the original performers. Forti remembers a radiator with pipes and a rope around it. Morris remembers a big screw attached to the wall, which is what we see here. And the fact that she wrote these instructions sort of signaled to us that the work can be transmitted this way. She wrote these instructions for this book in anthology, which is really important for the movements of Fluxus and conceptual art, as well as the music that was developing at the time, around 1960. Again, the inclusion of her text signaled this new kind of a form that's related to dance, that's related to sculpture, but also architecture, literature, and music. The book overall highlights the work's relation to conceptual art, where all of the artworks in here, and some of them are performances, could be related in this kind of score or diagrammatic way. Most importantly, their appearance here indicates that words alone can transmit the works. And it's true also for these two dance instructions. So she includes huddle and slant board here in these visual scores. And I find it interesting that she does, because slant board is one of the harder works to learn. And the time travel between her writing these in 1961 and then making the videos in 2011 indicates that she sort of learned over time that slant board is one of the trickier ones to learn. It's also not totally surprising that these are communicated in this way, given their relationship to conceptual art and performance art. So here are just two works that are examples that are transmitted in these kind of, what I'm calling conceptual way, just through instructions. So the wall drawing by Salva Way just includes these instructions on the left, and then Yoko Ono's performance is encapsulated both retroactively as like documentation, but also prescriptively as instructions here. It's also how the equipment is made. So the equipment is communicated to like the exhibition department at a new museum just through a PDF. There's no like teacher who's like going to the museum to help the museum make the equipment. So this also has a sort of conceptual model. So in a way, this model, the one I'm calling a conceptual model, for the two other things, for censor and from instructions, carries out a promise that the dance instructions held from the very beginning, that they could just be reproduced with no teaching, with no body-to-body transmission. All you need is the simple instructions and you create the works new, and every time. And it sort of implies that either the works don't change, or if they change, the changes don't matter, that those will be the works no matter what. This next model for Seesaw also doesn't require teaching, but it opens the work to dramatic changes. So in this work, two performers use this wooden seesaw, developing a relationship to each other physically and also emotionally. And each movement in one sort of engenders a response in the other, and they go through this very tense, very dramatic performance over the course of about 15 minutes. Yvonne Rainer was one of the first two performers with Forti's then husband, Robert Morris. At that time, the work lasted about 15 minutes. There were a few little embellishments. You can see these elastics attaching the slant board to the wall. Forti was monitoring the lights, so she was turning them on and off, and then at the end she came in singing a song, which sort of like concluded the work. When she took the work with her to Latico Gallery in Rome in 1969, some of these elements were dispensed with. She was one of the performers, so one guesses that she probably did not come in and sing the song at the end because she was already doing the work. They didn't have elastics on the end. You can see that there, probably because of the space. It seems like they adapted to a lot of practical requirements. She included the work in her 1981 retrospective piece. Huddle was also included in this work. When it was performed then in her own loft and also at the kitchen in New York City, it included a picnic basket, it included some grapes. It sounds like it was really elaborated from the descriptions that exist, and it went through quite a lot of changes in that rendition. But when she revisited it at MoCA in Los Angeles in 2004, they reverted to this red color scheme. It was a male presenting person and a female presenting person, and it retained some of the elements that she describes about the original one in 1960, which included a newspaper magazine. There's one of the people eats an apple partway through. And it seemed like they were trying to emulate that original version. When I saw her transmit it in 2011, the same thing was true. Brenda here is eating an apple, and they were wearing that like red sweater ski with the shorts. It's always going to have an element of in-the-moment decisions because it's based on that physical prop. So negotiating this static and this dynamic elements sort of applies to all of the dance constructions, and it especially applies to Seesaw. By the time we were in Salzburg and I was working with her on the retrospective, I observed Forti letting go altogether of the original version. She did cast 3 pairs of female presented people and male presented people, and they tried using some of the quote-unquote original elements, like the art magazine, and for whatever reason it wasn't quite working, and she encouraged them then to sort of make their own versions, to develop it with their own sensibilities. And the 3 different pairs came up with like really, really different versions with really different tones. They all stayed on the Seesaw more or less, but they had very different performance qualities throughout. And some of this was really practical. Like, she wasn't going to be there through the whole run of the show, so she couldn't come in and sing the song at the end. She wasn't going to be able to do some of the embellishments that she had done in the previous versions. So as she sort of like loosed this work into the world, she was becoming more and more open to it changing. And here's a version in Sweden in 2015. This was right around the time that it was acquired by MoMA, in which 3 people are doing the work. And both versions, you can see they come off the board and they're like underneath it. They're doing something, you know, they don't stay on the board the whole time. This one in the Netherlands used this chunk of clay, almost like a third character. It was really beautiful. They like spread it around and threw it around. And in this one, it's 2 female presenting people, which is a direction that she's allowed it to be opened to. In her official instructions for MoMA, she wrote, "Seesaw cannot be taught, but must be created newly by a director. The basic ingredients is a seesaw that is a board and a support that balances on the support, and performers. The director can come from any field of the arts, a choreographer, architect, theater director, poet, composer, etc. It is important to find someone really interesting and with fresh ideas to create their version of Seesaw." And so what we see here is in the Judson Dance Theater show at MoMA in 2018. This was towards the end of the run. They're actually all dance makers, Andros Brown, Will Rawls, and Martita Abril. But they have interpreted what Forti called the domestic drama into being something about immigration politics in the United States. So Abril is translating their dialogue into Spanish, and they keep using the seesaw board, as something like a border wall. They're like corralling the audience into the corners, and they're using it to divide people. They've taken that domestic drama to be about domestic politics. So I think that this model, so there's the conceptual model, and then there's this one where it's like completely created anew, like really emphasizes dance's ability and propensity to change over time. She's like letting people push that even further. As Sarah was explaining to us, like nothing stays the same over time, and she's making that really obvious. Like, if I'm not going to oversee it, then somebody with their own ideas should oversee it and make those evolutions really dramatic. And she also takes herself completely out of the work in this respect. It's like she sort of loosed the idea into the world and wants it to evolve. And as I mentioned, this tension between the static and the dynamic is implicit in all of these models, but in Seesaw, it lends itself more towards the dynamic changes that'll happen over time. This next one, the qualified teacher, is the one that perhaps we're most familiar with. This is like the transmitter model. She calls them qualified teachers. These videos that we made at her gallery in 2011 were really important because they pinned down the details for many of the works. So this model applies to 6 of the works, majority of them. And For a lot of them, she had just been making it up in the moment, like how many performers, how long this stuff lasted. It was kind of an improvisational thing. Her practice was improvisational, so she would just see what the occasion called for, and she'd make it up. But these, definitively pin them down. She also wrote a set of textual instructions. But more importantly, they indicate that they need body-to-body transmission in order to continue. And that's what you see here, is Forti providing her own embodied knowledge to the performers. And the fact that it's establishes that it's her bodily knowledge, either through herself or through some kind of proxy, that is going to be needed going forward. So this teaching guarantees quality and authenticity in the performance, which guarantees the works themselves. So this mechanism of the teacher is what convinced MoMA that they had the actual dance instructions. It sort of created a preciousness around the works that they may not have been able to acquire otherwise. So if in 1961 these works appeared that they could just be done anywhere at any time, that the performers didn't need to learn anything, they could just go straight into participating in it, these videos and the teaching indicate that no, actually, the work is really carefully considered. The movement qualities and performance qualities are, have attentive oversight by Forti herself or a qualified teacher. Forti here, you can see teaching huddle at MoMA, but what is out of the frame is the other 5 teachers that she's taught. So this occasion of the Dresden Dance Theater exhibition was also the occasion upon which she was teaching her 5 qualified teachers. They, like Rayner's transmitters, live all over the place in a bunch of different continents. And they get called up to restage the works when they are on loan from MoMA. So effectively, she duplicated herself in these teachers for another generation. They were all people that she had worked with extensively before, so had a pre-existing relationship with. One of them is Sarah Swenson, who's down on the floor with the video, who teaches and makes decisions in the place of Forti when these works are borrowed by other museums. So when a museum such as MoCA is borrowing the dance instructions from MoMA, they get the building instructions to build the equipment. They get a teacher who has the teaching instructions as well as the teaching videos, and she enlists and trains the local performers, except the works we've already seen, so censoring from instructions and Seesaw. So legally, this operates like a license for a film. So it's shown in a particular location for a particular length of time. But practically speaking, it's a little bit like a repertory and technique. So they created a set of models for these dances that tell us that they are not, and maybe never were, open to performance by anyone. That the supposedly pedestrian or neutral performance qualities are carefully considered and technical, even if it doesn't appear that way. In the 1960s, Forti's works seemed to remove style and skill on purpose for aesthetic effect, but the recordings and the teaching process produced those dance-related dimensions of the works 50 years later. So you might say this. And in addition, the continuation plans for Huddle mean that the museum itself, whether it likes it or not, becomes a facilitator for the continued spread of Huddle. So let me explain how this works. Forti taught this work to so many people for so long, starting in 1961 and continuing until the moment that they were acquired and even now today, that she herself did not have complete ownership or control over it. She wrote in the official artist statements that went to MoMA, "As I have taught Huddle in hundreds of movement workshops across the world, it has taken on a life of its own. I have made it clear that whoever has learned it is free to teach it and do it, and as long as it's being done in an informal context, I don't even need to know about it. From time to time, some former students send me a picture of a huddle that they've done in a studio or in the street in some distant land, and I see that huddle has managed to hold its form and its name through the decades, unquote. And when she I was going to use the word sold, but it's not quite that. When she let the museum acquire the dance constructions, she wanted this practice to be able to continue. And she wanted the museum to preserve this dimension, the outside dimension of the work. So when museums request huddle for a loan, it goes through the official process. They identify a qualified teacher who uses Forti's notes and recordings to teach huddle to new performers, and this is like a museum quality huddle. They usually perform it in galleries at regular intervals, and they credit MoMA as the lender. But outside the museum, practitioners can go on making huddle as they always have been. So she stipulated in the acquisition agreement that this work continue to be allowed to be performed in informal contexts, that they continue the practice of sharing the work. The people who learned the piece from Forti in their workshops in past years and who sought to teach it to other people would be allowed to do so without this transmission being challenged as unofficial or inauthentic, or a violation of MoMA's right, of its performance rights or its copyright. So if you view the performance of the dance constructions like a license for a film, the huddle license is not exclusive. It can be shown in many different times, in many different places, by different producers. So in addition, teaching huddle for exhibitions allows the work to spread, because every time it's taught to new performers, they then have the ability to teach it to people in their own communities. So they can expand this knowledge that they've gained inside the museum beyond the museum's walls. And the plan doesn't assert which one is right or better. It doesn't assert which steward is right or better. Both the museum and Huddle's community have access to authentic versions of the work. So it kind of leads to the question of, like, are they going to trend away from each other? Are they always going to stay the same? Or maybe like one community, the outside community or MoMA, like stops doing it for whatever reason. During the pandemic, obviously the museum couldn't facilitate performances of the work, so the only huddles that were existing were like outside huddles, like the unofficial versions. So it's probably not surprising, given that Forti was an improviser her whole life, that she set up these models that will sort of trend away from each other over time. And she's letting each different one play out sort of differently. I think all of the models leave it open as to which is the best model for continuing dance, the models that exist in the institution or outside of the institution. There was a conventional model used for most of them. This is the transmitter, which is like the répétiteur or the rehearsal director. This established repertory and technique. It established body-to-body transmission via this proxy for the artist. But there are important exceptions. So the conceptual model implies that you can just jump in and participate. And altogether, they insist that there are aspects of the dance instructions that will never be incorporated or assimilated at the museum. So the model, the first one I presented, suggests that they don't need body-to-body transmission at all. The seesaw model suggests that maybe someone else, the next generation, can do it better, and Huddle puts it into the hands of the community as to like, it's like an additional guarantee on the museum. And I think leveraging the institution in this way makes it into an experiment that will play out long after the artist has done this. So this is where we get to make a huddle, if you want to. So I would encourage it. It's about 7. I think we probably need 2 groups if everyone wants to participate. It takes about 7 to 10 people to make one, and it really doesn't take that much room. So we could do one here, and we could do one back there. But I would say take off your shoes and anything that's
element in this oath, which is sometimes which is very, I think, dominant. Also, the reason why we have this label, probably, do not touch dance constructions. And I loved how you brought in the idea that they are made every time anew. They are not allowed to be patinated, which is an interesting concept in itself. When you look at dance or visual arts performance, whether the concept of patina could be kind of applied to it at all, but there is also so much more sculptural stuff that is going on in those. And I wonder, whether you could speak a little bit more to this kind of sculptural object-based or objectness, perhaps even, of those works, especially in relation to those works which you were presenting. Whether the idea that they are reiterated, remade every time anew now, it's perhaps just a, temporary occurrence, and perhaps they will be, kind of acquired into the collections soon, carrying some traces, or the knowledge also of those who made them, because we speak about dances and performance as human based, right? It's knowledge which is very bodily, but those objects are too, in a way, executed via a technique or a skill by those who made them. So I wonder whether there is also the aspect, of this bodily transmission to the object production itself.
Yeah, one of the things that I think working on this project and coming to it with a dance background is to recognize the embodied knowledge that is already in museums, or is already in the practice of conservation. So there is already so much bodily knowledge that happens in these spaces, either from like an invigilator or a security guard who's standing there all day with the works and they understand how visitors interact with works. Or let's say on the other side, behind the scenes, so many conservation practices require like extremely skilled embodied knowledge, like be it either painting or whatever it is, like reformatting different kinds of materials, etc. In some ways, it's kind of like they get reformatted every time they are performed. That's one metaphor that I think I've been using, or I've thought about over the years. It's not exactly the same, though, I think, because they are created anew every time. Forti calls it reconstituted. They're reconstituted, which could mean, in English it means like something gets back to itself, like it comes back together. And Morris wanted that for his sculptures from the very beginning. And interestingly, a lot of the works have been acquired as precious objects, and they're not remade every time, which if one was following like orthodoxy of how he intended for them to be made, he would remake them every time. These aluminum, so these columns were originally plywood, but the ones we see in this photograph were eventually manufactured in aluminum and then kept in the Guggenheim in aluminum. So it's the aluminum that is preserved, the aluminum object, not like remade every time, which according to the logic of the sculptures would be that they would be remade every time. And I think I'm answering your question. Another thing that occurs to me when I think about this is that what are works losing if they don't have a custodian with bodily transmission? Is there, and this happens informally through artists' assistants or artists' estates. And even I use the example of LeWitt, which is a bit of a cheat, because LeWitt does have specific individuals who execute certain drawings, not all of them, but some of them are specific individuals who are now in their 70s. So the question is whether those works would be able to be passed along. And for Forti's works, it's still an open question. I think Forti's very much at the end of her life right now, and I think the transmitters, or they're called qualified teachers, are having a little bit of a hard time thinking about what happens. Are they allowed to teach the next generation? it's sort of like something no one wants to talk about. But I think it's assumed, understood that that's what would happen going forward into the future. Yeah.
Maybe it's terminology about the conservation practice of transmission, now the model and the qualified teacher, but how do they stand with reenactment? Or could they become after they, I just assume that reenactment would be a more closed form in a way, but it's just like open thinking. But I'm just wondering that the terminology of reenacting a work is never coming up.
I mean, I think in my own experience with museums and visual art language, I think reenactment assumes more like fidelity to an original. Yeah, reenactment assumes.
Where is the art setting?
Well, so that's what I was going to say, is that dance doesn't really have an original. Like, a dance does not have an original. It is produced anew every single time. And even in, like, with the logic of rehearsals, like, by the time something reaches the stage, like, you've already done it in rehearsal a whole bunch of times. So there's no, like, original thing that's tracked back in the same way that, like, an original object is. One of the things that my research has taught me is that maybe through these like teaching videos, that is the original. So maybe a new original is created at the museum. And that's one of the hypotheses, that the dances that are kept elsewhere are going to trend one way, and the originals at the museum are going to stay some kind of, true or original. But with these works, it's confusing. Like, are the ones in the museum more authentic, or the ones outside of the museum more authentic, right? And the only one for which that's possible is Huddle. Yeah.
But I think onto that point, I mean, thank you for your presentation. Really, really fascinating. Well, one, I was fascinated by it getting kind of this smoothness, this kind of sheen when it goes into the museum and what the museum does to the dance. But I also think it must be something in terms of the teaching and the pedagogical, when you're teaching someone something, in that doing of that, rather than just say, well, by teaching something, there's a need to articulate so someone learns something, and in that process, things get a bit more shaped or a bit more articulate. Do you know what I mean? Whereas if a huddle goes on in the corner and everyone just shows up and does it, versus a dance where you're teaching someone something, the teaching of something actually, I think, starts to bring that smoothness or that articulation just by the act of
I think that's
happening.
What I'm saying.
Yeah,
I think that's what I'm saying, is that there's a formalization of knowledge that happens in the transfer of knowledge. Like, I deliberately didn't give a lot of instructions in this huddle so that you just try it out, which is, it's sort of the spirit in which I first learned it, and the spirit in which she presents it in her workshops. But it's probably I haven't participated in a museum presentation of any of these works now in 10 years, so I'm not exactly sure how it's happening. Yeah.
But was there a lot of negotiation with the museum? Because as far as I understand, it's about value, right? The value of something is in its ownership, and it doesn't get shared, and museums have an interest in that. So I'm really curious how that negotiation went with MoMA in terms of it being allowed to be percolating outside of the museum, because then what they own would lose value. I mean, in a very crude way.
According to her, from the very beginning, what makes it special is also that it's been shared for so long.
And the museum kind of came to.
And the museum would have to acknowledge that. Yeah. Just for Huddle, though, not for.
But that's a very political thing, isn't it? I mean, it's saying that something that is shared is valuable versus.
Yeah, it's a totally different set of values than the museum typically has for like a precious object. There's only one of them, and she's saying no. Actually, it's a value to share it. It's a value to spread it and propagate it, and to have it not be like a formal thing. Yeah.
I just reread the score at the moment, and then the question is, could the score be the original? Because it's quite specific, and again, it's really quite specific.
That score was from '74. This score is about 61. So you start getting into that question, and then you start getting like super forensic like this, right? Like we don't know exactly which day in June 1961 she wrote this, but it was before that, and you know, like, and here it's clear that it's already been done before because it says sometimes it happens that there are 3 climbing at once. That's all right. Like it implies that like that's already happened and she's tried it out. Even the first instance of that, the original huddle, is unclear. Like we think she did it in Robert Dunn's composition class, but we're not sure.
Of display of the pieces is indicated as a requirement for the acquisition or not? Because I imagine that in the case of huddle, that the work will be transmitted is quite sure, but maybe in the case of other dance constructions, the museum has the authority, is the only authority to allow this display. And I do this question because I'm studying performance collecting in Italy, in Italian museums, and there I'm studying the documents, the acquisition documents, and just one time I found this indication. But there are many cases in which museums acquire the works but never displayed them in 10, 15 years, for example. So I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, some people are really worried about that. Like if you don't do them often enough, then the knowledge would be lost. Athena Krista Holbrook, who was the conservator on the inside, was the collection specialist who was in charge of the dance construction. She's no longer at MoMA, but we remain close, and that's a really big concern of hers. She feels really strongly that they should be performed every year, that there should be workshops in the community every year to make sure that people are learning them. I don't know that it's that important, but that's just kind of a personal opinion. I don't know that it matters that they haven't been, because they've lasted this long, you know, like I don't know, but certainly other dances or other performances are much more specialized, have much more like complex needs and like details that need to be worked out in the moment. I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, I've been working on this question of acquiring performance now for like 15 years, and at first I didn't think it was true that every work sort of has its own logic and has its own timeline, and that there's an individualized solution for every performance work. But I kind of think so now, that like each work demands its own things and has its own like internal structure that's going to allow it to keep. In the acquisition documents, no, they're not. They filled out a questionnaire, a standardized questionnaire, and it just says regular performance. I think Athena really interpreted that to mean like every year, but the department certainly hasn't done it. Yeah.
It's just a general observation. I'm wondering what everybody thinks. Precisely those works that in this very dense time, 60s, 70s, have a very strong political underscore. And we talked with street action that Gonzalo said, well, why do they want it? There needs to be a purpose, but if she's not there to request that, who's going to request that? And I'm thinking like of works like maybe Helio Oetica or Licha Clark that came about under very strong, dictatorship. So what meaning do they have nowadays when we rework these pieces? Are they in terms of a documentation of, or can they be transferred to other conflicts so easily?
No, that's right. I mean, in some ways, you could view the contemporary performance of these as a documentation of something that happened in 1960 or 61, right? There's no rule that says documentation has to be something fixed, like in a video or a photograph. Like maybe these are just like a shade of what they were. I mean, for me, I think because Huddle is created new every time, I think you still can learn about each other and about distributing weight and cooperation. You could still learn that when you do it. And certainly the people in the museum who are doing that are not having an experience, right? And one of the things that's really striking, which I'm sure you've experienced when you've transmitted Trio A, is that the people doing it have a really moving emotional experience. Like not everyone seeing it does, and it sometimes feels a bit like cut off from some greater context. Which kind of answers your question also, is a work like always relevant, right? Like not in it, that applies to objects as well. Like some objects are created in really specific socio-political moments, and they may or may not be relevant when you put them back on view 100 years later or 50 years later, right? But some of the performances you're talking about, like we're done in the street or we're done like in response to a really specific political moment. And the question is like, if you restage them, and that goes to this question of reenactment as well, like and that has to do with authenticity, like what constitutes its authenticity? Is it it's being in its own time and place, or is it being live? I mean, I think we understand now that just for the mere fact of something being live doesn't necessarily make it authentic, right? Like, there's a line about Tina Segal's work that I love that's like, he sort of undermines the notion that something live is automatically authentic.
Yeah.
So first of all, I wanted to thank you both for teaching us the movement, because maybe it's because I'm a conservator, but it doesn't happen often that I am part of the work. I am more the observer outside. And funnily enough, I was the one who was not able to follow the instruction, that made a mistake in the instruction. So it's very funny. I found it lovely. But
also there are no mistakes.
Yeah, okay. I didn't cross completely.
Just doing it is the thing.
Yeah, it's incredible how much you enter and you understand and you get a sense of the details that otherwise, as a spectators, you will never be able to get. Mm-hmm. And also in case of like trying to think about how am I going to preserve this work in my role of a museum worker, being part of it is what is probably going to teach me more about how to do it. At the same time, I wanted like a clarification about the future of these two pieces. So you have like a list of qualified teachers and transmitters, but this is still like a temporary solution for the time being. So the future is still unwritten for both artwork, correct? Or
well, I think to reiterate, and there may be things that I don't know, like there may be conversations taking place that I don't know about, but as far as I know, those conversations have been really hard for the transmitters, for the qualified teachers to have about the next generation. I think the museum has the expectation that the qualified teachers would train new teachers. Mm-hmm. But I think the qualified teachers are having a really hard time making that decision.
Because this was not decided at the moment of acquisition. Okay. And this was like...
You would think it would be, right? Like the museum holds things forever. I think that's another way that it's interesting, that it's like pushing back against the museum.
Yeah, like an acquisition I worked on, that was one of the requirements from the artists. And the conversation was around, okay, so how do we identify this second generation? I mean, is going to be totally on the first generation, or does it have to happen before the artist dies? And like that was the conversation.
I think it's been a really hard conversation to have. And to be clear, in the questionnaire, it does say that maintaining a group of high quality teachers is what's going to make the works live. But that's a general thing. It doesn't say who those people are going to be.
In its network of care, but
I did ask Ivana on with a glass of wine Seriously. And I said directly, like, when you are no longer here and I can't teach this anymore, what do you want me to do? And she was very direct. She said, almost like, why would you ask the question? She said, well, then you teach the next transmitter.
Oh, so she does give you that power.
Yeah.
So you have this power to do it, but how are you going to choose the next?
I actually have some, I have...
One wonderful topic that we also had in London, right? What if we are no more around?
Well, I don't know that the transmitters for the teachers, I mean, we are all over the age, I think we're all over the age of 45 to 70. And the other day I did say to her, I'm getting a bit creaky at times. And she said, oh, Pat still teaches it even just with the words, not having to do all the movements. But I do have someone in mind, actually, who's 30 years younger than me, who's very enthusiastic, and I've worked with a little bit. And I think of her, like, in the future. But I hope I'm still doing this when I'm 85. I don't know. But what's the age of the teachers?
They're all over, I would say 50. There's no, like, particularly young person in the group.
But I wonder if those questions, those are hard questions. When we ask questions of people, we're actually asking questions about when they are not here. I mean, who wants to talk about
It's
that?
always been about death. From the
It's always about death.
Yeah.
But then it's like, in the moment that you are transmitting it to someone else, it's a matter of like ownership. You are owning it.
Well, that's right.
Transmitting it.
One of the things
you are owning something that it was technically not yours.
I feel like you're a vessel and you pass it on. It goes through you to someone else. Yeah.
Yeah. My metaphor is that you sort of share a body for a while. You like share a body with the original artist, and then that body doesn't exist anymore, and then you share it with somebody else.
But those artists are still around, as you alluded to, like, you know,
In
like
the generation.
people we don't have around anymore. They are around through words and memories, and they're in the room. Yeah.
We need the endorsement of the artist.
Endorsement.
Well, I think that's the trust, right? Is like in selecting Sarah to be the transmitter, she's also selecting Sarah to make those choices. Yeah.
There was a...
Yeah?
Even Rainer's sold Trio A?
No, that's a great question. You might know more than I do. I mean, I've been curious about that. If MoMA or another institution has approached Yvonne to purchase Trio A, I don't know if they have, but
I'm not able to.
Okay, she knows say anything. Anyways, they might have, but
I don't know about Trio A, and it's clear to see what point.
but I do wonder with Rainer, and this is my own subjective opinion, I think. And the teachers are being paid, I assume, to do that, teaching. She doesn't want this YouTube video of her that's on YouTube to be used as a tool to learn it. And I just have to wonder if there's some politics around that too, of keeping the labor and the economy of it in living dancers being paid to do the work, and keeping the labor and the financial kind of passing on through. We're not institutionalized, but I think also Rainer is she's always been really kind of pushing back with institutional. She's not like Trisha Brown, who made a dance company, or Merce Cunningham. And for better or for worse, she works really informally. And I don't know if that's always serving the work, but that's her choice. But I do feel that I'm asked very informally often. I get literally an email, would you like to teach it here or there? I was wondering how they choose with Simone's work. Who do they call first in terms of the teachers? Because usually it's geographic, whoever's closest.